July 20th, 1944. Wolf's Lair compound, East Prussia. General Erich Hoepner storms into Hitler's bunker office, pistol drawn, hand shaking, uniform soaked with sweat. Hitler sits calmly at his desk, hands folded, no guards in sight. "It's over," Hoepner says, voice cracking. "The war, the Reich, everything." The room is stifling. No air circulation, just the smell of concrete and stale coffee. Hitler looks up, no fear in his eyes, just cold calculation. The lamplight catches the Iron Cross on Hitler's uniform, the same medal Hoepner wears on his own chest. Both men earned them in the same war, the same mud 26 years ago. Hitler's lips move. 4 words. That's all. Hoepner's gun hand drops. His knees buckle. The weapon clatters to the floor. A decorated general, armed and desperate, falls forward and kneels. What could Hitler have possibly said to break a man holding a gun to his face? August 4th, 1918. Somewhere in the trenches of the Western Front, a 29-year-old corporal named Adolf Hitler crouched in the mud, surrounded by the bodies of men who'd been alive an hour earlier. The artillery had stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. He'd been a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts, sprinting through no man's land while machine gun fire turned the air into a swarm of metal hornets. Dangerous work. Most runners didn't last a month. Hitler had survived 4 years. On this particular morning, he'd carried orders through a bombardment that killed his entire unit. When he returned, there was no one left to report to. His commanding officer found him sitting in the crater, still holding the dispatch pouch, and recommended him for the Iron Cross First Class. For an enlisted man, this was almost unheard of. Officers got medals, corporals got graves, but Hitler got the medal. He pinned it to his chest and never took it off. Not in the chaos of Germany's collapse, not during the beer hall fights of the 1920s, not when he stood in front of crowds of thousands. The Iron Cross became his proof. I was there. I bled for Germany. I survived when others didn't. It wasn't just a decoration. It was his identity. Erich Hoepner earned his Iron Cross in the same war, but under different circumstances. He was an officer cadet in 1914, 19 years old, commanding a machine gun position during the First Battle of Ypres. When the position was overrun, Hoepner stayed behind to cover his men's retreat, firing until the barrel glowed red and his hands blistered. He was captured, spent 2 years in a French POW camp, and was awarded the medal after his release. Unlike Hitler, Hoepner stayed in the military after the war. He became a professional soldier, a panzer tactician, one of the Wehrmacht's most respected commanders. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, he watched Germany's humiliation, the Treaty of Versailles, the hyperinflation, the street battles between communists and Nazis. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Hoepner saw a fellow veteran, someone who understood what they'd all sacrificed. He attended Nazi rallies, not because he believed the ideology, but because Hitler promised to restore Germany's honor. And for a while, it seemed like he might. Hoepner commanded panzer divisions in Poland, France, and the early days of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Victories came fast. Germany was strong again. But then came the orders. Civilians executed, villages burned, entire populations erased. Hoepner saw what was happening in the East and realized the man wearing the Iron Cross had become something unrecognizable. By the summer of 1944, Hoepner was part of a conspiracy. Secret meetings in Berlin apartments, coded conversations, lists of officers who might be persuaded to act. The plot was called Operation Valkyrie, and it was simple in theory: assassinate Hitler, seize control of the government, negotiate peace with the Allies before Germany was annihilated. The man chosen to plant the bomb was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a war hero who'd lost an eye, his right hand, and two fingers on his left hand in North Africa. Hoepner's role was to coordinate the military side, secure Berlin, arrest key Nazi officials, ensure the Wehrmacht stayed loyal to the conspirators, not the Führer. The planning took months. Every detail mattered. Every potential betrayal had to be anticipated. On July 20th, Stauffenberg would attend a conference at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair compound in East Prussia. He'd carry a briefcase with a British-made bomb inside, set the timer, leave it under the conference table, and walk out. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb would detonate. Hitler would die. Germany might be saved. Hoepner waited in Berlin that morning, wearing his uniform, his Iron Cross polished and gleaming. He met with other conspirators, went over the final details, and tried not to think about the fact that if this failed, they'd all be executed. Around noon, he received word. The bomb had been planted. Now they just had to wait. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. 4 men died instantly: a stenographer, 3 officers. The conference room was obliterated, the walls blown out, smoke and debris everywhere. Stauffenberg, watching from a distance, saw the explosion and was certain no one inside could have survived. He bluffed his way past the compound's checkpoints, boarded a plane, and flew back to Berlin, convinced Hitler was dead. But inside the wreckage, Hitler was alive. The heavy oak conference table had shielded him from the blast. His trousers were shredded, his eardrums damaged, his right arm bruised. But he was standing, walking, functioning. Within an hour, he was on the phone, barking orders, organizing the response. Communications from Wolf's Lair were cut for several hours, which meant Hoepner and the other conspirators in Berlin didn't know the truth. They believed Hitler was dead. They activated Valkyrie. Troops were mobilized. Key buildings were surrounded. For a few hours, it looked like the coup might actually succeed. And then, just after 1 a.m. on July 21st, Hitler's voice came over the radio. A speech, live, unmistakably him. A small clique of ambitious, irresponsible, and at the same time senseless and criminal officers have formed a plot to eliminate me. In apartments across Berlin, conspirators froze. The coup collapsed within minutes. Some fled. Some tried to destroy evidence. Hoepner sat in his staff car, listening to the broadcast, and felt something break inside him. The mission had failed. His name was already on a list. He was a dead man. Most of the conspirators tried to run. Stauffenberg was arrested at the Bendler block in Berlin and executed by firing squad within hours, shot in the courtyard by torchlight. Others went into hiding, were caught within days, dragged before the People's Court, and sentenced to death by hanging, their executions filmed on Hitler's orders. But Hoepner didn't run. Time 0.5s. Instead, he climbed into his staff car just before dawn on July 21st and told his driver to head east, toward Wolf's Lair, toward Hitler. The driver stared at him. "Sir, they'll arrest you the moment we arrive." Hoepner nodded. "I know." He didn't explain his reasoning because he wasn't sure he understood it himself. Maybe it was pride, refusing to be hunted like an animal. Maybe it was guilt. He'd sent younger men to their deaths and couldn't bear the idea of outliving them. Or maybe it was something else, something he couldn't articulate. He wanted to face Hitler, to look the man in the eye and explain why, to say out loud that the Iron Cross he'd earned in 1914 meant something different than the one Hitler wore now. The drive took hours. They passed roadblocks, checkpoints, columns of SS troops moving toward Berlin to crush the last remnants of the coup. At one checkpoint, an officer recognized Hoepner and waved him through, either out of respect or because the arrest orders hadn't reached that far yet. By mid-morning, Hoepner arrived at Wolf's lair. He tucked a pistol into his coat, dismissed his driver, and walked toward the compound. Wolf's lair was chaos. The smell of burnt wood and explosives still hung in the air from the previous day's bomb. SS guards were everywhere, rifles slung, eyes scanning for threats. Several conspirators had already been arrested on site, dragged to cells in the basement of the main bunker. Hoepner walked past them, past the wreckage of the conference room, past officers who stared but didn't stop. Him. Maybe they assumed he was there on official business. Maybe they were too exhausted to care. Or maybe this was the part that haunted him later. They wanted to see what would happen. Hoepner had been a respected general for 2 decades. If he walked into Hitler's office and didn't walk out, it would send a message to anyone else considering resistance. He reached the entrance to Hitler's private office. 2 guards stood outside, but they didn't challenge him when he opened the door and stepped inside. The room was smaller than he expected. Maps covered the walls, overlapping and pinned haphazardly. A single lamp burned on the desk. And there, behind the desk, sitting calmly, was Hitler. He wasn't reviewing documents or barking orders. Time, Ziolau, Vasaves. He was just sitting, hands folded, staring at the door as if he'd been expecting Hoepner all along. Hoepner closed the door behind him, reached into his coat, drew the pistol, raised it, arm extended, aiming directly at Hitler's face. His hand was shaking, but the distance was short. Impossible to miss. Hitler didn't flinch, didn't shout for guards, didn't move, just sat there, looking at Hoepner with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite contempt. "It's over," Hoepner said. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. The war, the Reich, everything. Hitler tilted his head slightly, the way a teacher might when a student gives an incorrect answer. Time, 05s. You came all this way to tell me that? Hoopner's finger tightened on the trigger. I came to finish what Stauffenberg started. Hitler glanced at the pistol, then back at Hoepner's face, as if the weapon were a minor detail, barely worth acknowledging. Then, why haven't you pulled the trigger? It was a fair question. Hoepner had walked through a dozen checkpoints, past armed guards, into the office of the man he'd spent months planning to kill. The gun was in his hand. Hitler was 3 meters away. And yet, something held him back. Was it doubt? Fear? Or was it the need to explain, to justify, to make Hitler understand why this had to happen? You've destroyed Germany, Hoepner said, voice rising now. Time, 0.5s. Everything we fought for in the First War, the honor, the sacrifice, you've turned it into a nightmare. The atrocities in the East, the camps, the millions dead for nothing. You've made us monsters. Hitler listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving Hoepner's face. When Hoepner finally stopped, the silence stretched out. 10 seconds. 20. Hitler's right hand moved slowly, deliberately across his chest, not toward a weapon, not toward a bell to summon guards. He touched the iron cross pinned to his uniform, held it between his thumb and forefinger, and let the lamplight catch the metal. Then he looked up at Hoepner, and for the first time, something like emotion flickered across his face. Hitler spoke. Time 0.5s, 4 words. Quiet, almost conversational. You remember the mud. Hoepner's breath caught. His gun hand wavered, just slightly, but enough. Hitler saw it. The Western Front. Autumn 1917. When the rain didn't stop for 3 weeks and men drowned in shell craters because the mud was too thick to climb out of. You remember? Of course Hoepner remembered. Every man who'd survived that war remembered. The cold, the stench, the rats, the bodies half buried in the muck. The way your boots would sink to the knee with every step, and if you fell, you had to crawl because standing took too much strength. The way you'd sleep, standing up, leaning against the trench wall, because lying down meant drowning. Hitler's voice was soft now, almost hypnotic. We were there together. Not in the same unit, not side by side, but in the same hell. We earned these, he tapped the iron cross on his chest, in the same mud, before the politics, before all of this. Just Germans, trying not to die. Hoepner's mind flooded with images he'd spent decades trying to forget. The face of the French soldier he'd killed in hand-to-hand combat, close enough to smell the man's breath. The sound his best friend made when a sniper's bullet took off the top of his skull. The morphine-dream delirium of the field hospital after he was wounded. And yes, the mud. Always the mud. Hitler leaned forward. That's who we were, Erich. Soldiers, survivors, brothers in something bigger than ourselves. Everything since then, the politics, the choices, the war, it's all built on that foundation, on what we endured together, on what we became in the mud. Hitler stood slowly, keeping his hands visible, and stepped around the desk. Hoepner's gun was still raised, but his arm felt like lead. Hitler walked closer, stopping just a meter away, close enough that if Hoepner pulled the trigger, there would be no missing. But Hitler wasn't looking at the gun anymore. He was looking at Hoepner's chest, at the iron cross pinned there, identical to his own. He reached out, not to disarm Hoepner, but to tap the metal with one finger. This is who we were, Hitler said. Then he tapped his own metal. This is who you still are. The distinction was surgical, precise, devastating. Hitler wasn't arguing that the war was justified, or that the atrocities hadn't happened, or that history would vindicate him. He was offering Hoepner a way to separate his identity as a soldier from his actions as a conspirator. You're not a traitor, the gesture said. You're a good man who made a mistake. You're still the officer who earned that medal in 1914. You're still my brother from the trenches. All of this, the coup, the gun, the betrayal, it's something that happened to you, not something you are. Hoepner's knees buckled. He didn't decide to kneel. His body just gave out. The pistol slipped from his fingers and clattered on the concrete floor. He fell forward, catching himself on his hands, gasping for air as if he'd been underwater. Hitler stood above him, silent now, the psychological trap fully sprung. He didn't gloat. Didn't call for guards, just waited. Outside, boots echoed in the hallway. Someone had heard the gun hit the floor. But inside the office, Hoepner knelt before the man he'd come to kill, and Hitler watched him break. The door burst open. 3 SS guards rushed in, weapons raised, saw Hoepner on the floor and the pistol lying nearby. They moved to grab him, but Hitler raised one hand. Wait! The guards froze. Hitler walked to the pistol, picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated, and placed it carefully on his desk. Then he looked down at Hoepner, who was still on his hands and knees, shoulders shaking. The general is confused, Hitler said, his voice neutral, clinical. He's exhausted from the events of the last 2 days. Take him somewhere he can rest. Treat him with respect. The guards hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of test. But Hitler's tone left no room for argument. They lifted Hoepner to his feet, gently as if he were made of glass, and let him out. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just let himself be guided down the hallway, past the other arrested conspirators in their cells, into a small room with a cot and a single barred window. They locked the door and left him. There, Hoepner sat on the cot and stared at the wall. Hours passed. That night, an officer arrived with a typed document, a confession. Hoepner signed it without reading it. What difference did it make? The next morning, August 8, 1944, he was taken before a military tribunal. The trial lasted 20 minutes. The sentence was death by hanging. But here's the detail that nobody talks about. Hoepner's death certificate, unlike those of the other conspirators, listed his cause of death as execution under military law rather than traitor. Hitler had given an order, never recorded, never documented, but carried out nonetheless, that Hoepner's name be treated differently, not with honor exactly, but with an acknowledgement that he'd been once a German soldier. Over the next 6 months, more than 5,000 people were arrested in connection with the July 20th plot. Around 200 were executed, many after-show trials where they were screamed at by judges, denied lawyers, and hanged with piano wire from meat hooks. The deaths filmed so Hitler could watch later. But Hitler's handling of Hoepner became a story that circulated among Wehrmacht officers, whispered in private conversations, passed along through letters that were carefully burned after reading. The story went like this. Hoepner walked into the wolf's lair with a gun. He pointed it at Hitler's face. And Hitler, instead of calling for guards, reminded him of who they both used to be, of the mud, of the Iron Cross, and Hoepner knelt. The psychological impact of this story was devastating. It didn't matter that the details were murky, that nobody knew exactly what Hitler had said or how Hoepner had responded. What mattered was the moral. Hitler held the key to their identities. If a decorated general like Hoepner, a man who'd fought in 2 wars, who'd led panzer divisions across Europe, could be broken not by threats but by memory, then what chance did anyone else have? Several generals who'd been wavering, who'd been considering whether to join the resistance, quietly stepped back. Better to stay silent than risk discovering they were just as vulnerable as Hoepner had been. And so, the resistance collapsed, not because of the executions, but because of the doubt. Hitler's most effective weapon wasn't the Gestapo or the SS. It was the Iron Cross and the memories attached to it, and the way he could use a shared past to paralyze men who should have been his enemies. By the end of 1944, there were no more serious attempts on his life, not because people didn't want him dead, but because they couldn't reconcile killing him with who they believed themselves to be. April 30th, 1945. The war really was over now. Soviet troops were a few blocks from the Führer bunker in Berlin, their artillery shaking the walls, their tanks grinding through rubble that used to be streets. Hitler had less than an hour to live, though he didn't know the exact timeline. What he did know was that Germany had lost, that the Reich he'd built was collapsing, and that the only way out was a bullet. His staff had evacuated or fled. Only a few loyalists remained, clustered in the deeper sections of the bunker, waiting for the end. Hitler sat in his private study, a small concrete room lit by a single bulb. On the desk in front of him, a pistol, poison capsules, and his iron cross. He picked up the medal, the same one he'd worn since 1918, and held it up to the light. The engraving was worn smooth in places from decades of handling. He traced it with his thumb, the same gesture he'd made that morning in July 1944, right before Hoepner walked in. According to one of his secretaries, who survived and gave testimony after the war, Hitler spoke aloud in those final minutes, not to anyone in particular, just to himself, or maybe to the ghosts of everyone who'd worn the same medal. "You remember the mud?" he said quietly. Then he put the iron cross down on the desk, picked up the pistol, and shot himself. When Soviet soldiers stormed the bunker hours later, they found his body, Eva Braun's body, and the medal lying on the desk where he'd left it. A Red Army lieutenant picked it up, pocketed it, and took it back to Moscow. Today, it's in a Russian museum, displayed in a glass case alongside other artifacts from the war. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most don't know the story behind it. They just see a piece of metal. But here's what that piece of metal represents: Hitler's ability to weaponize shared identity, to take something sacred, a symbol of courage and sacrifice, and twist it into a psychological tool that could break men without firing a shot. Hoepner wasn't the only one. There were others, officers who might have acted, who might have stopped the war sooner, who might have saved lives, but didn't. Because when they imagined standing in front of Hitler, they imagined that moment when he'd touch his iron cross, remind them of who they used to be, and ask if they were really willing to betray that version of themselves. The answer, too often, was no. Hoepner was executed 4 days after his trial. His last words, according to the executioner's report, were simple: "I served Germany." Not Hitler, not the Reich, Germany. Maybe that was his way of reclaiming the medal's meaning. Or maybe it was just what men say when they've run out of options and need to believe their lives meant something. Either way, the Iron Cross outlived him. It outlived Hitler. It's still there in that museum. In Moscow, a small piece of metal that once convinced a general holding a gun to kneel instead of fire. You think you know how power works. Through fear, through violence, through force. But sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is a memory, a shared past, a reminder of who you used to be, and the unspoken threat that betraying it means betraying yourself. Hitler understood that. And on July 21st, 1944, when Erich Hoepner walked into his office with a loaded pistol and every reason to pull the trigger, Hitler proved it. 4 words: You remember the mud. That's all it took.